Anybody here not know who Jim Mars is? Okay, for the one lady here who does not know who Jim Mars is, Jim Mars is a career-long journalist. He has written several best-selling books. Crossfire, which is his 30 years documentation on the JFK assassination. Rule by Secrecy, which was number 17 on the New York bestsellers Times list. Alien Agenda, and Spies, which is about the government psychic spies. And we do have Lynn Buchanan here this weekend, who will be doing a brief introduction on remote viewing, so you'll learn all about that as well. Well, without further ado, let me introduce Jim Mars.
He was a war hero despite the loss of his ship. Well, you know, when you have your PT boat cut in half by a Japanese destroyer, you know, they got two choices. You know, you're either the hero or you're the heel. And since he was Joseph P. Kennedy's son, they decided he was the hero. Actually, he was. If y'all don't know anything about the story, and I don't want to get too dress off in too many things here, but his engineer was severely injured in this collision. And he literally took the guy's Mae West strap in his mouth and swam a very, very long distance and saved the guy's life. So he really was. And then they found out they were on Japanese-held island, and they all wanted to surrender, and Kennedy talked them into not doing that. And he said, let's just wait and we'll figure out a way out of here. And sure enough, some natives showed up from nearby islands that were in the hands of the Allies, and they managed to get word back that they were there, and the Navy sent a submarine, I think it was, and they got him off. So he managed to get back with all his crew. So he really was kind of a hero. He was the best educated president we've ever had in this country. He wrote a book about how that England got into World War II. It may have been ghost written, but nevertheless, he was very smart about what was going on in the world. He and his brother Robert, who he named as Attorney General, were fighting organized crime. And in fact, one of the members of the Kennedy family once told me that if Kennedy had not been assassinated in '63, that within another year or so, they would have broken the back of organized crime in this country. Just think what kind of country we might have with no organized crime. He tried to bring the CIA and the military under control. We'll be hearing more about this and how they got out of control and where we kind of went wrong, and it actually predated Kennedy. The Kennedy Tax Act of 1962 started closing tax loopholes for the multinational corporations. Up until then, if you had an office in New York, you paid taxes there, but if your refineries were in the Bahamas, you didn't pay taxes. Kennedy said, nope, you're going to pay U.S. taxes on a U.S. corporation no matter where your assets are. In June of 1963, you can see a $5 bill. Notice it's got red ink on it, and notice at the top, it doesn't say Federal Reserve Note. It says United States Note. In June of '63, Kennedy authorized the issuance of $6 billion in currency as United States notes. Well, does that mean that $5 bill is worth more than another $5 bill? No. What it means, though, is we don't have to pay interest on it. Now, the last president of this country to issue interest-free money was Abraham Lincoln when he issued the greenbacks during the American Civil War. And I don't think it was just coincidence that both of those men were shot in the head, because you do not mess with the money boys. Everything he was doing, he was coming up against who I would call the globalist. The people who are looking at a global economy, the people who want to bring us into a global economy. And otherwise, you may hear me refer to them as the New World Order boys, because this is the New World Order that George Herbert Walker Bush spoke about. This is Jack Ruby's club here to the lower left, as it was in fall of 1963, and here's a picture of his stage and one of his dancers, Kathy Kay. She was a gorgeous lady, had a Cockney accent because she was from Britain. And we've got a very questionable character here who is dancing with her, and I think may have some part in all of this. And we have this fellow identified. This is me at age 20, dancing on dancing on the stage of Jack Ruby's Carousel Club. And the only reason I show you that, other than just morbid curiosity, is to assure you that I was alive, aware, in Dallas, met Jack Ruby, knew what was going on. I know I had fraternity brothers. I went to University of North Texas in Denton. Had fraternity brothers tell me, if you ever want to get in a high-stakes poker game, just go to Dallas and look up Jack Ruby. And they said, but be careful, because he's connected to the underworld. See, at that time, we'd never heard of the mafia. We didn't know what the mafia was. You know, in fact, J. Edgar Hoover was assuring us that there was no such thing as the mafia. And some of you young people have to understand that this is a whole different time and place. And, but we knew that he was connected to the underworld even before the assassination happened. And of course, the Warren Commission, I knew that as a college kid. But the Warren Commission couldn't seem to find any evidence to show that Jack Ruby had any connection to organized crime. All right, we go to Dealey Plaza. So what we have now is we've got Kennedy bucking some of the biggest, baddest factions in this country. The CIA. He threatened to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces, cast them to the winds after the Bay of Pigs because he realized how out of control they had become. Organized crime. Bobby Kennedy and his organized crime task force was, as I said, about to break the back of organized crime. And then you've got the multinationals. They're all mad at him. He forced the steel manufacturers to roll back their price increases after they reneged on a bargain. The steel workers were trying to strike. Kennedy and his administration got the steel manufacturers. They said, okay, look, we'll call the workers off. We won't have the strikes if you won't raise your steel prices. And they said, okay. So they called off the workers and the strikes, but the steel manufacturers went ahead and upped their prices anyway. And I think this was an early attempt to show Kennedy who was really in charge. But Kennedy didn't take it laying down. He went to the public, got on television and said, this is unconscionable and they can't do this. And then he began to take concrete steps. They began to let steel contracts, not through U.S. Steel and the big guys, but through secondary and tertiary steel companies. And it didn't take them very long before they said, okay, and they lowered the steel prices. So now you got big business, you got the multinational corporations, you got the CIA, you got the military, and they're all mad at Kennedy. Now, in the fall of '63, they were getting ready to go into the election year of 1964, so he comes to Dallas. And here you can see the motorcade route. It came down Main Street to the middle of downtown Dallas. There were crowds 12 and 14 deep, cheering, smiling. The people loved Kennedy. But as Senator Ralph Yarborough confirmed to me, if you look above street level and look at those big old towering office buildings in downtown Dallas, he said he never saw one smile. There was a big disconnect between the way the people felt about Kennedy and the way that the high rollers did. And here's another view. Probably this looks like it was probably taken from the criminal courts building, but you can see that, number one, Dealey Plaza is not that big a place. The car turned, the whole motorcade turned and made a 190-degree turn in front of the Texas School Book Depository in total violation of Secret Service regulations, which stated that you would not make a turn of greater than 90 degrees, and if you had to make a turn of 90 degrees, that there would be security people stationed at that point. And this didn't happen. There was nobody there. Closest security people they had was there was a policeman stationed there on the corner. They said that 3 shots came from this 6th-floor window, which you can see is only partially opened. This next picture is a picture of the building. This picture was taken by a military intelligence officer. Now, you might want to ask yourself, what is a military intelligence officer taking pictures of the front of the school book depository for before any shooting started? And we know he was there, and we know he did all this because he made the mistake of going into the building and then had to show his credentials, and he got on the record by it when he had to get out after they'd sealed it up. Here's a picture I took from that window before the 6th-floor museum plexiglassed it in, so you can't actually get to that window. And you can see that we've definitely got some problems here. The floor is right here, so the window is only about a foot off the floor. You got two 2-inch pipes to the left of the window. The window was only half open, so you've got a heck of a deal of trying to curl up here and get a rifle aimed off down the street through this window. But the major problem that I hope you're already beginning to see is that where the first shot struck was right about here. You see what the problem is? There's a tree that intervenes in your line of sight. And you'll hear all kinds of explanations. Well, they trimmed it down, or it was fall, or whatever. These are evergreens. They stay green well into the spring. And that tree today is pretty close to the way it was in '63, because I know of twice when it's been trimmed back. Once for a TV documentary called The Trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and then for the Oliver Stone movie. Okay, here's Kennedy and Jackie moving through the crowds downtown. This gives you an idea of their relative position. Now, Kennedy is sitting on a big leather seat in the back, and Governor Connally is sitting on a little fold-down jump seat. So you can see that he sits a little bit lower than Kennedy and Jackie, and as they turn, here's Greer, the driver, and here's Nellie Connally as they turn in front of the depository. This is a photograph taken by James Atkins, who was an Associated Press photographer who was down in the plaza and shooting back up. And if you could see this very sharply, you could see that Kennedy's hand is up near his throat. He's already reacting to having been shot. And this little white blob right here, that's Jackie's white glove. She's holding his arm. And everybody else is beginning to look around like, what was this? And you see the problem with the tree. Attention for a long time was focused over here in the doorway of the Texas School Book Depository, because in this blow-up, you can see that there's a fellow with a high forehead and an open shirt with a white T-shirt on underneath it, leaning out the window. Marguerite Oswald always said she thought that was her son Lee leaning out the door of the book depository. And there is reason to believe this. But it's also, they said, that it's actually this fellow, Billy Lovelady, who was also an employee of the School Book Depository. Now, the problem is, Billy Lovelady said he was sitting on the steps, and this fellow obviously is up here leaning around looking out the window. But it's an interesting point, and it'll probably never be absolutely clear. But it's interesting to know that when the police asked Oswald where he was at the time of the shooting, he said he was at the downstairs lunchroom. And a few days later, they found his jacket and his clipboard in this downstairs lunchroom, which is just one small flight of stairs from this doorway. When you went in there, they had a flight of stairs that went up to a mezzanine and another flight of stairs that went down into kind of a basement where this lunchroom was. All right, this shows us what's going on in Dealey Plaza. We've got, here comes Kennedy in his car. He's already been shot. We got people running from Main Street to come try to get back down here. We've got Mary Mormon in black and Gene Hill in the red raincoat. And we got Charles Brim and his son right here. We got the Babushka lady, or Beverly Oliver, who was filming. We've got a guy with an umbrella standing right back here, and a guy with a dark complexioned man who's standing right on a line with him, okay? Right up here is Abraham Zapruder taking his famous film, and then here is the Newman family standing there. As Kennedy begins to pass, this is a frame from Zapruder's film, and as you can see, at this point, as he's coming down the street, he has not been hit. His hand's still up in the air. Everybody's smiling and laughing. But now, as you can see, as he passes from behind the sign, he's been hit. He's clutching at his throat. Now, this one is a very important slide. According to the official version, at this point, he's been hit and Connolly's been hit. His fifth rib's been shattered, and his right wrist has been shattered by this same rifle bullet. And yet you can see right here that Connolly's pretty much unperturbed and is still holding his Stetson hat in his right hand. He hadn't been hit. All right. Here you can see the umbrella moving up the side of the sign, and you can see this dark-complected guy raising his arm in the air. So here's two of the most suspicious men in Dealey Plaza, and the FBI couldn't ever find out who they were. You see, Clint Hill is the only Secret Service agent to react, and he was not supposed to even be there. He wasn't assigned to President Kennedy, he was assigned to Jackie Kennedy. And at the last minute, Jackie said, but I like Clint Hill, I want him to come along. So it was a last-minute change. Clint Hill was on there, and he was the only one to react to the shooting. Here's Mary Mormon, and here's Gene Hill in the raincoat. And this is Emmett Hudson right here. He was the groundskeeper for the north end of the plaza. And when they asked him where the shots came from, he said, back up behind me where the police patrols were, except there were no police up there. Now, this has been the object of a lot of mis and disinformation. They say Jackie Kennedy was trying to escape the car or trying to help Clint Hill or whatever. None of this is true. Clint Hill, once he reached the car, managed to get a handhold, the car began to speed up, and it was all he could do to hang on and slowly pull himself up on the back deck and then crawl into the car. If you can see the Zapruder film in its entirety, you'll find that Jackie Kennedy crawls back there, braces herself, reaches out and picks up a piece of the president's head, and then by her own power crawls back into the car. And this is all well verified because at Parkland she was sitting there, and when a nurse came by, quite pathetically she said, "Here, will this help?" Okay, and that's all well documented, and yet you don't hear this. And why? Because if a piece of the president's head's lying on the rear deck of the car, that's indicative of a shot from the front. Immediately, everybody was in shock. The Newmans hit the ground. You never hear much out of Bill and Gail Newman, do you? They're still alive, still have an electric company over in Garland. Very nice folks, just the nicest folks you ever want to meet. But you don't hear much out of them because that day and to this day, they said the shots came from up over their head and were whizzing over their head from the grassy knoll. And they threw themselves on their children to protect them. Gene Hill, Mary Mormon sat down. Babushka Lady is still standing there. Charles Brim and his son, they hit the ground too. And notice where they're all looking. They're looking up here. They're not looking back towards the school book depository. And a few seconds later, everybody finally, the shooting had stopped, and they kind of screwed up their courage. And where did everybody run to see what had happened? They're not running towards the school book depository. They're running towards that grassy knoll because that's where they all knew a shot had come from. And this is what the scene looked like behind the stockade fence on the grassy knoll. Immediately, there was people up there milling around, and they essentially destroyed any potential evidence that was up there. Was there evidence up there? Yes. Sam Holland and a bunch of the railroad people were up on the triple underpass, along with an officer named J.D. Foster. And they said that they heard a shot and saw smoke drift out from under the trees there on the grassy knoll. And so as soon as they could collect their thoughts, they too moved around and went in that area. And they got there before the crowd rushing up from the street. And they said that there was muddy footprints behind the fence, cigarette butts, as if somebody had stood there for a long time. And we go back and again we look at the umbrella man and the dark-complected man, and they're standing in a direct parallel to each other, and it's almost as if they're signaling when Kennedy gets parallel to them. And the theory is that they were visual coordinators. They're there to look and say, well, it doesn't look like he's dead, so they give a signal, and that means more shots have to take place. And sure enough, the fatal headshot took place just a little past this position. Now, look, as I said, these are the two most suspicious guys we've got. Number one, it was a bright, sunny, shirt-sleeve day. Why do you, in fall, wasn't hot, why do you need the umbrella? He's the only guy with an open umbrella in Dealey Plaza. This guy also is pretty questionable. Now, these are blurry pictures because nobody was taking pictures of them. They just happened to be in the background of some of these photographs, and you blow them up. Then these two most suspicious characters sit down next to each other on the curb. Here's the guy's umbrella folded up at his feet. And then this guy, we call him the dark complexion man because he looks dark, maybe a black man, maybe a Cuban, Hispanic. And then here they are too. And look at here, is this guy packing heat or what? He's got something in his jacket. Right here, they're sitting there. The dark complected man holds something up to his face. And you can see a wire coming out from behind his head. And it's like he's talking on a walkie-talkie. And then while the crowd is rushing up the slope to the grassy knoll, he calmly gets up and sticks that walkie-talkie back in the back of his pants and saunters on off. And the umbrella man stops and looks back at him and then turns to walk off the opposite way. Now, these are two of the most suspicious characters in the whole scene. And the FBI, who could locate junior high kids running through Dealey Plaza, has never been able to identify who these people are. Now, there was a fellow that came forward at the time of the House committee who said that he was the umbrella man, but his story doesn't jive at all with what we see happening in these pictures. Furthermore, as the Dallas News reported back in the 70s, many people, including Dallas police officers, encountered men that flashed Secret Service identification when there were none in that area. The patrolman that I mentioned, who was there near the front door of the school book depository, heard shots down from his right, thought somebody was firing down near the railroad bridge, the triple underpass, went running down there, smelled gunpowder hanging in the air, and encountered a man in a suit and tie, and the guy flashed him Secret Service identification, said everything's under control here, so the patrolman turned around and went on off. Well, who are these folks? And where did they get Secret Service identification that was good enough to fool a Dallas policeman? Another Dallas police sergeant, Harkness, went around to the back of the school book depository and said there were men back there, and they said Secret Service. So he continued to search elsewhere. And yet there was no Secret Service people at that time. Interestingly enough, this is a section out of Inspector Kelly's interview with Lee Harvey Oswald. And Oswald said, "Are you FBI?" And he said, "No, I'm with the Secret Service." And Oswald said, "Oh, well, you know, when I was coming out of the school book depository," he said, I asked Mr. Truly if there was going to be any more work that day, and he said, "No, go on home." So I was left to go home. And he said, when I walked out the front of the building, a young man in a suit and tie ran up to me and showed me a book of identification and said he's with the Secret Service and he needed to find a telephone. And so I directed him to the telephone and stood there to make sure he got to the telephone there at the back of the building. And this is the same guy who supposedly less than an hour later shoots down a Dallas policeman far out in South Oak Cliff who just stops him on the street. See, none of this makes any sense. And then about 1:30, down South Oak Cliff, though, they get a report. Now, the president's been shot, one of their own police officers has been shot, and the Dallas dispatchers get a call saying somebody sneaked in the theater without buying a ticket. So on the basis of that heinous crime, they rushed 15 squad cars, FBI, an assistant district attorney, and according to several people, men who claimed they were with the CIA, who most people had not even heard about at this time, and they all converged on the Texas Theater. And we get our first view of the accused assassin as they were hauling him out of the theater, and he's shouting, "I'm not resisting arrest, I'm not resisting arrest," you know, indicating he was fearful that they might try to do him bodily harm. And they had their suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, a very interesting character. Oswald's favorite TV show was I Led 3 Lives for the FBI, Herbert Philbrick. Some of you older folks may recall that. Richard Carlson, as I recall, was the actor that played Herbert Philbrick. And so Oswald always kind of had a penchant for maybe being an undercover guy. And so when he gets in the Marines, though, he had a hard time because the first time in basic, he failed to qualify with his rifle. The second time they tested him, he managed to get sharpshooter by 2 points. And then finally, as he was getting out of the military, they made him qualify again, and this time he only qualified for marksman by 2 points. Now, they've played that up and misdirected you by saying, wow, he was a marksman in the Marines. Well, that sounds pretty good, but it's not, because there are three classifications. There's marksman, sharpshooter, and expert. And I know because I fired expert, because I wanted that pass to New York. So the first time he couldn't qualify. Second time he managed to get by 2 points into the second level, and on the third time they tested him, he only qualified by 2 points into the lowest level. And actually, this is pretty shoddy performance for a Marine. Now, if you're just a regular old Army grunt like me, it doesn't matter a whole lot. But for Marines to fire marksmen, that's almost a disgrace. He gets sent to Japan, and all of a sudden over Japan in his record there's these gaps and mysterious absences and weird things that happens. He shoots himself in the arm or something, instead of pistol discharged, and things are going on. He also is hanging out at a very expensive nightclub called the Queen Bee, all right, that are full of beautiful Japanese hostesses and generally regarded as a spook hangout where agents would gather. This is where a lot of the officers went. It's reported it would cost you at least $100 a night at the Queen Bee. And of course today that's not a lot, but in 60 and 61, 59, $100 is a lot of money. And Oswald did not have that kind of money. He was getting, his pay was something like $70 a month, and he was sending most of that back to his mother. But we find in his Marine medical records that he was treated for gonorrhea. This is something the military tells you is a no-no. Don't do that. Safe sex, don't get those venereal diseases. And yet in his medical records he said, contacted in the line of duty, not through his own misconduct. So he really was an undercover agent. Now let's look at Oswald. What an incredible character. When the assassination took place and he was killed that same weekend, he was only 24 years old and had just barely turned 24. His birthday was in October, so he was just about a month past his 24th birthday. Young guy. And yet he had been at this Atsugi base, Japan, which was the largest CIA facility in the Far East. I've mentioned the inconsistencies in the record. He was supposedly able to speak Russian immaculately. You've got people who knew him at the time who said, yeah, he was recruited into U.S. intelligence. You've got James Wilcott, who was a CIA paymaster, who testified that he had paid out money from the CIA to Oswald. There's microdots was a typical spy technique of reducing information to the size of a dot, and this term was found in his notebook. The House Select Committee found that there was a 201 file within the CIA on Oswald, something that had never been mentioned before and certainly was never told to the Warren Commission. Well, we've got 5 former CIA people that said if he had a 201 file, that's a personnel file. He worked for the agency. He also had a spy camera that had a 5-digit serial number on it, one of these little Minox cameras, commonly known as a spy camera. Had a 5-digit serial number. Well, the Dallas News investigated and found out that all of the commercially available Minox cameras at that time carried a 6-digit serial number. So he had a spy camera that was not commercially available, which means that somebody had issued it to him. Again, evidence that he was exactly what his mother said. In fact, that's the last one. Was Oswald a government agent? And you got all this evidence, plus his mother said so. They say circumstantial evidence isn't the best. We want the rifle. We want the fingerprints. We want the signed confession. But sometimes, if you'll think about it, the circumstantial evidence, it may be the best evidence because the fingerprints can be planted. The rifle can be planted. The evidence can be altered. Okay? But the circumstances are the circumstances. You can't change it. And what am I talking about? These files that came public in 1977 showed that less than 2 hours after the shooting, J. Edgar Hoover was on the phone to Robert Kennedy saying, we have our man in Dallas. It's Lee Harvey Oswald. He's an ex-Marine. He's a pro-communist. He's been to Russia. He's a mean-spirited individual in the category of a nut. So he's already building the case for this lone nut assassin, okay? But here's the problem. When Oswald was arrested, he had 2 sets of identification on him. One says he's Lee Harvey Oswald. The other says he's Alex James Heidel. And the police were going, well, which one are you? And he's being uncooperative. He said, you're the cops, figure it out. So at the very time when the Dallas police weren't even sure of who they had in custody, J. Edgar Hoover's already making it plain that it's Oswald and he's a lone nut. just setting up the cover story. You can see how the boxes were piled up. It would almost be impossible to get somebody back in there. They found the 3 shell casings lined up, or 2 shell casings actually, lined up next to the window in a row, which doesn't make any sense because if you're there at the window, firing out the window, when you act the bolt, it throws the thing over your right shoulder. Those shell casings should have been off over in the floor somewhere, and they're all lined up under the window. And immediately the cover-up began. Here we see at Parkland Hospital, and you see a bucket of water down here, and you see the agents, and they're all cleaning the car up. This is evidence, folks. This is evidence. You don't do that. If there's a homicide and you start cleaning the car up, you can be arrested for tampering with a crime scene. This is why they put that yellow tape all around everything. You got to keep it inviolate. This is very interesting too. In 1991, when the Dallas police finally opened up their police files, I find that the Dallas Police Intelligence Chief, Lieutenant Jack Revel, rode back from Dealey Plaza to the police station, by his own words, with a military intelligence agent. And he goes back, and the first thing he does is he runs into FBI agent James Hosty. And Hosty says, well, we knew about Oswald. He was one of our guys. What's going on here, you know? And so Revelle goes up and makes out a list of the Texas School Book Depository employees, and heading the list is a Harvey Lee Oswald of 605 Elsbeth. Okay? Now, here's what's interesting about this, and it tips us off to something. We know, of course, it was not Harvey Lee Oswald, it was Lee Harvey Oswald. He never lived at 605 Elsbeth, he had lived at 602 Elsbeth. But that Elsbeth address was not on any of the material that he filled out or applications at the Texas School Book Depository. So where did they get that address? And why was it wrong? And why did they get the name transposed? Because when the House Select Committee was investigating, they contacted a Colonel Jones of 4th Army Intelligence and down at Fort Sam, Houston, and he said that as soon as he got word that the assassination had happened, he went to the military intelligence files and looked up an A.J. Heidel, which was the name he had been given. And he said the name Heidel cross-referenced to a Harvey Lee Oswald of 605 Elsbeth. So there had been a mistake in the military intelligence files, and that same mistake is reflected in the Dallas police report, which means what? That the Dallas police were tipped off to Lee Harvey Oswald by military intelligence. Now the evidence quickly began to grow. They found this rifle on the 6th floor of the School Book Depository. Of course, the people who actually first found the rifle, Seymour Weitzman and a couple of others, they said it was a 7.92 German Mauser and that they saw Mauser stamped on the receiver. But by the time they brought the rifle out of the building and held it up, it had changed into a 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. They also said that they found this paper sack there in the building and that that's what Oswald had bootlegged the rifle into the building in this paper sack. And I ask you, just take a look at that sack. Does that look like it's held a rifle with a lot of gun oil all over it? No, not really. There's also even a problem with the Warren Commission. They show us this picture right here of a rifle, and they said that this is a replica of the ad that he used to order the rifle. Well, why do they show us a replica, I wondered. Why don't they just show us the real ad? Well, because the rifle they've got in the National Archives is 40 inches long. And as you'll see right here, that this is from the actual ad that he actually ordered the rifle from, and it says they were offering 36-inch long rifles. So there's a discrepancy in the length of the rifle. Now the Warren Commission, instead of explaining this discrepancy, they just show us a different ad. The next day, we've got a document with the J. Edgar Hoover's signature on it that said, no latent prints of value were developed on Oswald's revolver, the cartridge cases, the unfired cartridge, the clip in the rifle, or even the inner parts of the rifle. So the next day after the assassination, there's no usable fingerprints on that rifle, according to the FBI. Then Sunday, Oswald's killed in the morning. That evening, the rifle is sent back to Dallas by the FBI. And the next day, we see that the body of JFK assassin is under guard in Fort Worth. And in the story, we find that an FBI team with a camera and a crime lab kit spent a long time in the morgue. Well, I asked the funeral home director, Paul Grudy, what'd they do? He said, well, they put his hand on that rifle. He said, because my big concern was getting the fingerprint ink off his dead hand in time for the burial. And that afternoon, Henry Wade is holding a press conference and just offhandedly said, oh, have I mentioned, we've got his fingerprints on the rifle. Well, that sealed it in everybody's mind. We all know he's guilty now because the fingerprints are on the rifle. And that rifle was a real piece of work anyway. Buried in the Warren Commission, you find the testimony of Ronald Simmons, who was head of the Army Ballistic Test Center. And they asked him, said, was it reported to you by the persons who ran the machine, did they have any problems sighting in the rifle? And he said, well, they could not sight the rifle in using the telescopic sight. Said, we had to adjust the sight by the addition of 2 metal shims. And then a page later, they said, but we have 3 metal shims. And he went, oh, yeah, that's right, 3 metal shims. And then the Warren Commission shows us pictures of the 3 metal shims. Here they are. These are 3 little metal shims they had to put under the telescopic sight to make it align with the barrel to make that weapon accurate enough to test. You couldn't have hit the broadside of a barn with that rifle. And there it all is. I'm not telling you some theory. The Warren Commission showed you the shims. And then other evidence, of course, piled up. I love this one because they said that's the paper sack under the pistol. And they said the FBI got it later and they were studying it. And they said they found a fiber on that paper sack that seemed to be similar to this blanket that they found in the garage of the Ruth Payne home, which would seem to be incriminating because that means, that there was a connection to that blanket. But wait a minute. They had the paper sack lying on the blanket when they took a picture of it by the Dallas police. Maybe that's where that fiber got on there. Anyway, that's how inconsistent this all is. Oh, this is pretty important. This is the Dallas Police evidence sheet as presented by the Warren Commission. And you'll notice that it says, well, you can't really read it, but right here it says 6.5 spent rounds, 3. Okay, they were saying there were 3 shots, so they had to have 3 empty shell cases, and that's what they found. You notice down at the bottom it's blank. Well, then again in 91, though, when the Dallas police files were opened up, I go over there and I get the actual evidence sheet, and it says they only had 2 shell cases. And down at the bottom it says paraffin test made on Oswald was positive on both hands, negative on the face. And I've got the actual nitrate reports. There were nitrates on his hand, but no gunpowder. And no gunpowder or nitrates on his face. And believe me, if he had been firing that old loose bolt Mannlicher Carcano, when you open that bolt and those gases come out, he would have had powder, gunpowder and unused powder and nitrates all over his face. That's court admissible evidence he did not fire a rifle that day. Nitrates can come from printer's ink, and he was handling books all that morning. Can also come from urine, but then I'm not going to talk about his bathroom habits. So. All right, here we've got 2 FBI reports, one released in 1980 and one in 1968. The one that was released in 1968 says that paper, wrapping paper available at the Texas School Book Depository matched had the same characteristics as the paper sack that they said he used to smuggle the rifle into the building. Well, there's incriminating evidence that, here's the sack and it matches where he works, so that's incriminating to Oswald. But in 1980, this document slips out, same document, same file number, same agent, says almost everything the same, except it says that the paper did not match the paper of the sack, which makes him more innocent. But we never saw that. And what is with this? And when the FBI was asked about why do you have 2 documents that look the same and say the opposite, they said, well, this one here, that's a fake document. Well, how many other fake documents have they got? And I think I can explain to you how that comes about. Here's something that nobody really knows. And again, it's a small thing, and yet this tells us and answers why the evidence in this whole case is so messed up. This is a copy of the official transcript of the deposition of James C. Cadigan. Now, James C. Cadigan was a ranking FBI officer with their laboratory. He was a fingerprint expert, okay? And we find in his official transcript that there's been some scratching out. Somebody's messed around here. And originally, they asked him, do you know why 820 was not reprocessed or desilvered? They're asking about some fingerprint matters. And originally he said, well, I could only speculate. And they said, yes. He said, well, it may have been that there was a very large volume of evidence being examined at the time. Time was of the essence. And this material, I believe, was returned to the Dallas police within 2 or 3 days. And it was merely, in my opinion, a question of time. We had a very large volume of evidence. There was insufficient time to receive it, and I think in many instances their latent fingerprints were developed. They do not desilver it. So then he moves on and says, well, can you explain why the signature of Lee H. Oswald, or rather Lee L. H. Oswald, is apparent while the signature A.J. Heidel is not? He says different inks. Why would they want to scratch that out? And besides that, tampering with an official deposition is a crime. Well, so what did that mean? Well, what we do is we find that, sure enough, in the Warren Commission and in the official deposition as published by the government and sent out to the public, they asked him why 820 was not reprocessed or desilvered. He said, no, this is a latent fingerprint matter. And that's exactly what somebody has written in here. Oh, it's a latent fingerprint matter. Somebody has come in and edited and changed an official deposition. Now, why would they do that? Because a little later, we find out that they asked him about all this great quantity of evidence, and they said, he said it was on November the 23rd of 63. 1963? Yeah, November the 23rd, 1963. That's the day after the assassination. That's Saturday. And the FBI had all of the evidence. And they had several agent examiners available to evaluate it. There were supervisory officials. There were representatives from Internal Security Division, all of whom had an interest in this matter, he said. Now we go to the testimony of Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry. He says, we kept getting calls from the FBI. They wanted the evidence up in Washington in the laboratory, and there was some discussion. Fritz told me, he says, well, I need the evidence here. I need to get some people to try to identify the gun, try to identify the pistol and these things. And if it's in Washington, how can I do that? But finally, about midnight, Friday night, that's the night of the assassination, we agreed to let the FBI have all the evidence, and they said they'd bring it back to their laboratory and that they would have an agent stand by, and when they were finished with it, they'd return it to us. And Mr. Rankin, chief of the Warren Commission, said, did that work out all right so far? And well, not exactly, because they were to give us pictures of everything that was brought to Washington. And Fritz tells me that some of these little items, that were very poor reproduction of some of the items on microfilm. Said, as far as I know, we still have never received all that evidence back. It's still in Washington, I guess. Perhaps the commission has it. And J. Lee Rankin, chief counsel of the Warren Commission, says, yes, the commission is still working with it. So they asked him again about why they turned this over, and he said, well, we got several calls insisting we send this, and nobody would tell us exactly who it was that was insisting. Let's just say I got a call from Washington, and they wanted this evidence up there. Insinuated it was someone in high authority that was requesting this, and we finally agreed as a matter of trying to cooperate with them. So in other words, on Friday night of the assassination, when the Dallas police are trying to conduct an investigation into what then was a Texas homicide, somebody in Washington pressured them into turning over all the evidence to the FBI, most of which never came back, and which was there the next day being pawed over by these top-ranking FBI officials. 4 days after the assassination, the Dallas newspapers and Fort Worth newspapers all carried the story that the FBI had been called into the case. Okay? And the FBI then took charge of whatever little bit of evidence they had shipped back, and it all became essentially a federal matter. So what am I telling you here? I'm telling you that for 2 full days, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, some of their top people, had all of the evidence in this case in their possession with no chain of evidence and with nobody looking over their shoulder. So when you find out that the evidence is screwy and this doesn't compare with this and this doesn't match that and I don't understand this, now you know why. They had every chance in the world to jimmy with the evidence, and as we've seen with these duplicate things where numbers change and descriptions changed, they did jimmy with the evidence. So you can't trust any of this evidence. And it was all done at the level of the federal government. Here's another proof of that. Here's Oswald's possession. By the way, there's his little Minox camera, okay, that carried the 5-digit serial number. The FBI came to the Dallas police, to the detectives that found all this, and tried to coerce them into changing their report to reflect that it was not a camera, it was just a light meter. And the Dallas detectives refused to do this. They said, we know the difference between a camera and a light meter. And of course, that's because the camera was not commercially available. Down here, you'll find pictures. These are supposedly photographs of the back of General Walker's house, okay, because we're told that Oswald's the one that went and took a shot at General Walker. You notice there's nothing wrong with this picture, particularly the license plate on the car. And yet, when the Warren Commission published this, somebody's poked a hole in the license plate of the car, so you obliterate the license plate so you can't trace to find out whose car that was and find out what was really going on at that time. Now that's destruction of evidence, and it happened while in the hands of federal authorities. Here's a page memorandum to the Warren Commission to J. Lee Rankin, the chief counsel, from one of their attorneys, Albert Jenner. And he's talking about a Mr. John Eli, who was assigned to do the background on Oswald. And down at the bottom it says, on the whole, Mr. Eli's memorandum presents a good overall picture of the course of events involving the Oswalds up to the time of Lee Harvey Oswald's entry in the military service. Our depositions and examination of records and other data disclose that there are details in Mr. Eli's memorandum which will require material alteration and in some instances omission. So by their own documents, they altered some of the information about Oswald and they omitted some. Is that any way to conduct an investigation? One of the most blatant things they did was when they printed in the Warren Commission the still frames from the Zapruder film, which nobody got to see for 15 years. They transposed these 2 slides, making it appear that his head went forward. And as we all know now, backwards to the left, backwards to the left, you know, Kevin Costner made that very clear to us. But back then you didn't know that. So in 64, 65, 66, 67, it all looked like he went to the front and it supported this. J. Edgar Hoover admitted that this was a printing error. It was the only printing error they had, and it just happens to transpose the headshot. Isn't that interesting? Now, this came out in February the 21st, 1964, and the headline reads, Lee Oswald with the weapons he used to kill President Kennedy and Officer Tippit. How's that for innocent until proven guilty? This was 8 months before the Warren Commission came out from behind closed doors and said, well, yeah, we believe on the basis of all the evidence that we can find that he probably was the assassin. Now, if you look at these pictures, it even gets stranger because what we find is there were 2 pictures, 31A and B. Now, these are supposedly taken with a little handheld camera, and Marina didn't know anything about it, so according to her testimony, Oswald cranked the film, gave her the camera, and then come walk over here, and he'd pose, and she'd snap his picture, and then he'd come back over and get the camera, and he'd crank the film for her again, get it back to her, he'd go back over, and he'd pose again. Okay, that's the story we get. Now, 2 separate photographs with a handheld camera should not match, right? If you made them into transparencies and laid one on top of the other, nothing should match. And yet, nothing does match except Oswald's face, and it's identical in both photographs, which is impossible except in one instance. And interestingly enough, Oswald himself told the Dallas police, he said, "That's my face, but that's not my body." He said, "Somebody's transposed my face onto somebody else's body." And that's what the evidence shows. In fact, you can see here that in the backyard photographs, he's got a big, broad, flat chin. Well, here's his Dallas police mugshot. Oops, he's got a little pointy cleft chin. And you can see, look at this line that runs under his lip and across all the way over to, from one side of the neck to the other. That's where they pasted his face onto somebody else's chin. This is the report of Captain Fritz. He said the picture was not his, the face was his face, but that this picture had been made by someone superimposing his face. And he's right. But of course, he said when he gets the chance, he could tell them how that was done, but of course, he never got the chance. Because as they are moving him, Jack Ruby steps out of the crowd and shoots him down. Interestingly enough, there were only the two photographs, but 15 years later, this photograph crops up in the hands of Roscoe White's widow. And now in this one, he's holding the paper in his right hand and the rifle in his left hand. And yet the Warren Commission, when they reproduced and reenacted the photograph, what pose do they use? Paper in the right hand, rifle in the left hand. They're reproducing the pose of this photograph, which was unheard of, unseen, suppressed for 15 years. So they're hiding evidence. Four-Star Telegram the next day showed a picture of a bullet that had hit across Elm Street in the grass and said one of the rifle bullets fired by the murderer of President Kennedy. Well, there's evidence. What happened to that? Well, Officer Foster right here was up on the triple underpass and he saw the bullet hit the grass. Went and told some superiors and they said, "Well, get over there and guard it." So he and Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters are standing there guarding this place on the grass. Wayne, Ned, and Hartnett that I talked to also had heard the shooting and run up about that time and saw him standing there and said, "What's going on?" They said, "Well, bullets landed here in the grass." And they looked and they saw it. So what happened to that particular bullet? Well, Chief Curry published these photographs and he said this guy, an unidentified FBI agent, here he comes, he's reaching down, and here he is putting something in his pocket, and he walks away, and that's the end of that, folks. It didn't happen. Now there's 4 bullets, and one of them's walked off. The person that really made them change their whole story was Jim Tague over here, and this is it's cropped off. He had a little nick on his cheek. He was driving up Commerce Street, got stopped when the motorcade came by, and they stopped all the traffic. He got out of his car and was standing there by the curb, and when the shooting started, something hit the curb near his feet, threw up either pieces of bullet or pieces of concrete, and nicked him on the cheek, caused a little cut on his cheek. Now he's the guy that messed up the whole deal. Because, see, they could have said 3 shots, and 1 shot hit Kennedy, 1 shot hit Connally, 1 shot hit Kennedy in the head, and they could have made us believe that. All right, but James Tague messed it up because now they got a 1 shot hit in the grass, but they picked that bullet up, walked off, it didn't happen. But now they got a guy with blood on his cheek that the 2 Dallas policemen and the deputy sheriff both made a notation of, and it was in the record. So now they got to explain what happened to him. So they came out then with saying, okay, the first shot hit Kennedy and Connally, and the second shot missed and nicked James Tague, and the third shot hit Kennedy in the head and killed him. That was their version of the assassination. But this required then what has come to be known as the single bullet theory. We read in the Warren Commission report their conclusions. President Kennedy was first struck by a bullet which entered the back of his neck and exited through the lower front portion of his neck, causing a wound which would not necessarily have been lethal. And then later they say, although it is not necessary to any essential findings of the commission to determine just which shot hit Governor Connally, there is very persuasive evidence from the experts to indicate that the same bullet which pierced the president's throat also caused Governor Connally's wounds. Now that's about as close as they come to telling us this story, this cockamamie story of a bullet that comes through, hits Kennedy, goes through his neck. Then they show us this diagram. Bullet comes through Kennedy's neck, doesn't hit any bone, doesn't hit anything to deflect it, goes right on through, hits Connolly in the back near the right armpit, shatters his fifth rib, comes out near the nipple on his chest, goes into the anterior side of his wrist, shatters his wrist bone, one of the densest bones in your body, and then ends up over in his left thigh. Okay? Now that is the single bullet theory. And I want, if you get nothing else out of this presentation, I want you to understand one thing very clearly. Kennedy was never shot through the neck. Autopsy clearly indicates he was shot at the level of the third thoracic vertebra. There's your third thoracic vertebra, and it's low in the back between the shoulder blades. And this document, by the way, is signed by Dr. George Berkeley, Kennedy's own personal physician. It's also marked on the autopsy face sheet. There it is right there. There's the bullet hole in the back. And this is marked, the actual copy of this face sheet is marked verified Dr. George Berkeley, Kennedy's own personal physician. But when the Warren Commission publishes the face sheet, where's that notation from Dr. Berkeley? Well, it's missing. It's been deleted. And that way, they've argued, well, this is just kind of a general approximation. Actually, the wound was somewhere up, higher up. It was up on his neck. It was not in his neck. It's never been in his neck. Here's his jacket, and there's the bullet hole. And the bullet hole's down in the back, between the shoulder blades, exactly where the autopsy places it. Here's his bloody shirt, and the bullet hole is in the back. They've argued this one, saying, well, he was waving, and when you wave, your coat hunches up, and it folds up, and it made it look like the bullet hole was lower than it was. Well, even if that's true, and it's not, your shirt doesn't bunch up. So the shirt, the medical testimony, the autopsy make it very clear he was shot in the back between the shoulder blades. Here is the Siebert O'Neill autopsy report. They were FBI agents sent to the autopsy to record what was going on, and they said, during the latter stages of the autopsy, Dr. Humes located an opening which appeared to be a bullet hole, which was below the shoulders and 2 inches to the right of the middle line of the spinal column. Hello? Exactly where the autopsy placed it. Clint Hill, his testimony. Did you see any other wound other than the head wound? Well, yes, sir. I saw an opening in the back about 6 inches below the neckline to the right-hand side of the spinal column. Pretty observant there, Clint. Secret Service agent Glenn Bennett's report. He said, I saw the shot hit the president about 4 inches down from the right shoulder. It's all consistent. He's shot in the middle of the back. So where did this neck thing come from? Well, in 1997, it finally is reported that Gerald Ford, our only unelected president, ordered the authors of the Warren Commission to change their wording from Kennedy was shot in the back to Kennedy was shot in the neck. And I don't know of anybody who's ever claimed that Gerald Ford has any medical credentials. Now, this shows you the political nature of this crime. This crime has never been properly investigated. It's never been properly studied, or the truth has never been really sought in this case. Because now, if you connect the back wound to the throat wound, instead of having a downward trajectory, you have an upward trajectory. So now what? It comes up this way. What does it do? Twist in midair and go back down to hit Connolly? Can't happen, can it? No, now we've got a bullet coming here, striking him in the back and hitting nothing, but somehow changed trajectories, comes out his throat, heading up, somehow changed trajectory, come back down, hit Connolly, then heads over into his wrist, and then ends up over in his left leg. It's the most stupidest, cockamamie thing I've ever heard in my whole life, but don't laugh. They put this on us, and we've all believed it for 40 years. Here we go, path of the bullet. Oh, yeah, look at that. Man, just zigzagging all over the place. Now, here we have the CE-399, the magic bullet, which is the foundation of the lone assassin theory, because if you cannot have that one bullet causing those wounds to those two men, then you cannot have a lone assassin. You've got more than one person shooting at the president. Now, here it is, the actual bullet, that supposedly did all that, hit a rib, hit You know, it just doesn't work. These are the same type of ammunition that have been fired into, this was fired into just the wrist of a human cadaver, and look how it flattened out the nose of it. This one looks almost intact, but it's all bulged out, and that was only fired into cotton wadding. And this one was fired into a goat carcass, and it just came apart. And here's this bullet with only this one small nick up here, and they're telling us that's the bullet that did all the damage. And that little piece right there, that's where the FBI chipped off some for spectrographic analysis, which they've never shown us the results of. J. Edgar Hoover told the Warren Commission that the spectrographic analysis, and this is where you check the metal composition of the bullet, all right? And it's either identical or it's not. And he said, well, they're similar. Well, similar doesn't count. Similar is like saying she's just a little bit pregnant. You know? You're either pregnant or you're not. They're either identical or they're not. And so obviously they're not identical, or they would have told us this. And here's the proof positive. This is Governor Connolly's wrist x-ray. You can see where it just broke the main bone there in his wrist. But you can also see these little white points. There was more pieces of bullet still in Governor Connolly's wrist when they buried him than is missing off the bullet that the government still claims caused the wound. That's how outrageous this whole thing is, folks. Even Connolly's own doctor said he was not struck by the same bullet that struck Kennedy. But here's the real smoking gun as far as I'm concerned, because did the Warren Commission understand all this? Or were they just as bamboozled as us and everybody else? Well, here's page 193 of the January 27th meeting of the Warren Commission, 1964. This is before they really got into their investigation. This is before they really went wild. But we hear their own chief counsel. And right in front of him, he says, well, it seems apparent, since we have a picture where the bullet entered the back, that the bullet entered below the shoulder blade to the right of the backbone, which is below the place where the picture shows the bullet came out of the neckband of the shirt in front, and that bullet, according to the autopsy, didn't strike any bone at all, that particular bullet, and go on through, so that how it could, and he begins to realize what he's saying, how it could turn in midair and go back and hit Connolly, so he stops. Smoking gun, folks. They knew that this cockamamie story did not hold up. So what did they do? They lied to you. Said he was shot through the neck, one bullet did it all, one lone assassin. They just lied to you. And here's our inspector demonstrating it, okay? And don't you love it? They've actually got the bullet marked down on the back on this guy. So to make him demonstrate the single bullet theory, he's got to hold his rod about 6 inches up and above the guy's shoulder, making it go through his neck, see? But yet there's the mark themselves. They marked the bullet wound right there. Are they a bunch of liars or what? Kennedy was never shot through the neck. Also, all the medical evidence is disarray. His brain is missing and still is missing. And they blame it on Bobby Kennedy. They say, well, I think Bobby Kennedy came and took it. Well, great. Let's blame it on Bobby. He's dead and can't defend himself. Slides of the autopsy are missing. Tissue is missing. If we had Kennedy's brain, they could probably tell you what really happened to him. The House committee showed us this drawing from an autopsy photograph and said, there's the bullet hole. That's exactly what it says. Drawing depicting the posterior head wound. There's the bullet hole right there, okay? Well, then a few years later, the actual autopsy shot comes out, and look, where's that hole? It's not there. You can see a blow up. There's hairs growing through there. Dr. Hume said, well, I don't know what that was. I've never seen that before. And here they show the bullet in the jacket, but then they've got the wound now. It's not in the neck, and it's not in the back. It's up here on the shoulder somewhere. The mysterious traveling wound. It just keeps moving around. All right. Now they show us these x-rays, supposedly of JFK. And look, the whole right front portion of his head's blown out. You see on the skull? Oh, look at that. It's just all blown out up here. Yeah, all up here is blown out according to these autopsy x-rays that they are now showing us in the public. Say, there it is. And yet, Gerald Custard, the man who took the x-rays, said, those aren't the ones I took. He said there was no damage to his face and no part of his skull was missing in the forward part of his head. These are fake x-rays. Now, that's not a conspiracy theory. That was stated by the man who took the x-rays. Furthermore, Floyd Reeby was with him at this same press conference, and he was the photographer taking the autopsy photographs. And he said that the photographs the government is now showing of the autopsy of Kennedy are phony and not the photographs I took. But you don't hear about that, do you? And here's the proof. There's the x-ray, and yet here's Kennedy. You can see the right front portion of his skull is just perfectly okay. What we do hear from back in 1992 was the AMA, American Medical Association. Oh, and they came up and they said, well, we looked at all of this, and why, Oswald did it all by himself, says Dr. James Lundberg, okay, who later got fired for unethical practices. So I guess we can't trust him very much. And the whole thing's cockamamie because they show, like the Warren Commission, this shot coming down through the neck, which it didn't. It hit down here in the back. And then look at this one. Comes from the left downward and goes out the right. This shot would have had to come from the court building over here somewhere, you know, because the school book depository is back off over here to the right. This is how cockamamie this whole thing is, but they expect us to buy it, and we do. Even Oswald's own mother back in 1967 asked for an exhumation because she said that the description of scars and stuff and of the body did not jive what she remembered. But of course she was a crazy old lady and nobody paid any attention to her. But Paul Grudy, the funeral home director, told me that 3 days after they buried Oswald, some Secret Service agent showed up and was questioning him about marks on the body and scars and things like that. And one of them finally commented and said, we don't really know who we have in that grave. Looky here. Here's a document dated 1960, June the 3rd, 1960, signed by J. Edgar Hoover, and he sent this warning to the Department of State. He said, since there's a possibility that an imposter is using Oswald's birth certificate, any current information the Department of State has would be appreciated. Think about that a minute. 3 years before the Kennedy assassination, J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, is personally aware of Lee Harvey Oswald and suspects that somebody's impersonating him. You never hear about that, though, do you? Maybe somebody was impersonating him. Now, this supposedly is all pictures of Oswald, but does it look like the same guy? Does this guy look like this guy? Does this guy look like this guy? I had a military intelligence agent one time, years ago, tell me that at one particular point in time, there were as many as 6 Lee Harvey Oswalds running around. And I didn't really quite understand what he was saying at the time, but as I go along, I begin to understand. You take the Mintz photograph that the Warren Commission shows us and the Moscow photograph that they show us, and you split them down, you find that here's heavy shadow, no shadow. Heavy shadow, no shadow. Now simply look at this side of the face. That does not look like the same guy here. And this guy doesn't look like this guy. And when you put some other pictures, such as his Marine picture with one of the Russian pictures together, and all the eyes match up and the nose and the mouth and everything looks like Oswald, but look, he's too short. He's an inch or so shorter. There's not enough for his head to match up. Lee Harvey Oswald was what they call a legend in the intelligence parlance. That means his whole persona, his whole history was created. And Dr. John Newman, a very respected military historian, has written a book called Oswald and the CIA, and based on CIA message traffic, internal message traffic, that's only been made public since 1990, he proved beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, and I can tell you this as an absolute fact, Lee Harvey Oswald was being used operationally by the CIA prior to the assassination for many purposes. But what he ended up being was a scapegoat, or as in his own words, a patsy. That's right. When they were hauling him down the hall of the Dallas police station, they were saying, "Did you kill the president?" And he said, "I didn't kill anybody. I'm just a patsy." And by the way, those words were recorded. And those recordings have been subjected to voice stress analysis. And it shows there was no stress in his voice. He was telling the truth. So who did kill Kennedy? Well, we've got the Mary Mormon photograph, and way up here, not behind this concrete retaining wall, there's Abraham Zapruder. And here's Kennedy at about the time of the headshot. But back behind that picket fence, somewhere back right about into here, this area, we can blow this up. This is not computer enhanced. This is not, it is simple blow up. You blow it up and you get this figure. Everybody see what has become known as the badge man? There's his eyebrows, his eyes, his nose, there's his ear, here's his hairline, here's his shoulder. He's wearing some kind of dark shirt. He's got a semicircular patch on his left arm, and he's got a bright, shiny object that has been determined to be metal on the front of his shirt. Looks exactly like a Dallas police uniform. And here's where they've kind of drawn in to show you what it is. This is unretouched. This has been drawn in so you see what you're saying. A guy firing a gun, blam, from the grassy knoll. Now, if this was any other case, and you had a photograph of a man firing from the grassy knoll, and you had the bulk of the witnesses in the south part of the plaza saying a shot came from the grassy knoll, if I tried to tell you there was not a shot from the grassy knoll, you'd hound me off the stage. But this is the Kennedy assassination. And who are you going to believe? Your government or your own lying eyes? So there he is, the person that killed Kennedy. Can everybody see that? Is that clear enough? When I showed this to some detectives that had graduated to be medical examiners for Tarrant County, they even said, look, he's wearing shooter's glasses, which he probably was. Why did they want to kill Kennedy? This is National Security Action Memorandum, and we find that Kennedy was going to pull us out of Vietnam. Because he says on October the 11th, he signed a 263, National Security Action Memorandum 263, and he said he considers, he approved the military recommendations contained of the McNamara-Taylor report, which said that we could have all the troops out of Vietnam by the end of 1964. He said, fine. He also said, make no public announcement, make no formal announcement of the implementation of plans to withdraw 1,000 military advisors. So he was going to pull 1,000 military advisors out of Vietnam before the end of 63. But he was going into election year, and he didn't want everybody to call him soft on communism, so he was kind of doing this under the table. He said, make no formal announcement. That's what got him killed. If he had formally announced, and then he got killed, then we went into Vietnam, everybody would have understood what was going on. But he was doing this quietly, so then they killed him, and then they stepped up Vietnam, and now they can still argue that, oh, no, we were just continuing his policy. He'd have done that. Because here we see Action Memorandum 273 that Johnson authorized 2 days after his assassination on Monday. And you see that first he says, the objectives of the United States with respect to the withdrawal of U.S. military personnel remain as stated in the White House Memorandum of October the 2nd, 63. Well, that's for the media and the public. Sounds like everything's the same. But way back over here in Section 6, it says, programs of military and economic assistance should be maintained at such levels that their magnitude and effectiveness in the eyes of the Vietnam government do not fall below the levels sustained by the United States in the time of the Diem government. Well, the Diem government, the Diem brothers were overthrown around October the 1st, 63. So in other words, now they're telling them, don't fall below the level of October 1st, 63. So that 1,000 military advisors didn't come home. Then we also see down here the plausibility of denial They're already starting to figure out how they can lie to us about Vietnam and get away with it. Down here, it talks about drop military plans against Laos. The next page, which I don't have shown, said also Cambodia. So this one already is laying the groundwork for the Vietnam War. Now here's what's interesting. That was National Security Action Memorandum 273, which was issued on Monday after Kennedy was killed. A few years ago, the rough draft comes out of the Johnson Library down in Austin. The rough draft of this order that basically negated Kennedy's pullout order and set us on a course for Vietnam War was drafted on 11/21/63, November the 21st, 1963, the day before Kennedy was killed. But while he was traveling in Texas, did somebody know that he wasn't going to make it back to Washington and that our policy was going to change? You bet they did. Finally, this is a letter from Evelyn Lincoln. Does anybody know who Evelyn Lincoln was? Kennedy's personal secretary. Now, kind of like the Newmans, with all the stuff and retrospective and stuff, how come, have you ever seen an interview with Evelyn Lincoln? No. And yet she was ubiquitous. She was there all the time. She was at his elbow day and night, you know, except maybe when Marilyn was there. But she was there the whole time. How come you haven't heard any interviews with Evelyn Lincoln? Because she writes in this letter from 1994, she passed away just about 2 years ago, as for the assassination is concerned, it is my belief that there was a conspiracy because there were those that disliked him and felt the only way to get rid of him was to assassinate him. These 5 conspirators, in my opinion, were Lyndon Johnson, J. Edgar Hoover, the Mafia, the CIA, and the Cubans in Florida. Hello? There we go. His own secretary tells you what's going on. And were those 5 characters all connected? Absolutely. Here's the Council on Foreign Relations members connected to the Kennedy assassination. Call your attention down here to the bottom where we find that Henry Cabot Lodge, Maxwell Taylor, and Ellsworth Bunker, these were the 3 U.S. ambassadors to Vietnam during that whole conflict. And in that National Action Memorandum 273 that Johnson drafted, it said the whole country team would be under the direct supervision of the ambassador. So these 3 Council on Foreign Relations guys ran the war in Vietnam, okay? And after Kennedy was dead and the anti-war thing started to build up, David Rockefeller, who was one of the leading luminaries of the Council on Foreign Relations, and others put out a page ad in the New York Times saying and arguing about why we had to be in Vietnam. And I might point out that that was their plan all along. After World War II, the Council on Foreign Relations issued some papers stating that the United States need to gain the material resources of Southeast Asia, which at that time was called French Indochina. All right? In 1954, at Dien Bien Phu, the French military got defeated and were thrown out. That's when we moved in. And within weeks, John Foster Dulles, one of the ranking members of the Council on Foreign Relations, had gone to the Philippines and formed something called the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO. And he later said that that was simply to give the United States president an excuse for intervention in Southeast Asia. So this was a war, Vietnam War was a war planned and desired by these globalists, by these Council on Foreign Relations people, and Kennedy was bucking them. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.